Hi there, and welcome to the debugging session. In this section, we will look at a scenario where we will debug a cluster. In our example scenario, we're receiving an email saying, my login token is not working anymore. My username is this, and my token is that. What the user means is that he's trying to log in to our Jupyter Hub instance, and there are two ways to log in. Either we can use single sign-on using Azure AD and OAuth 2, or we can log in using JSON Web Tokens. This method enables us to log in for a set amount of time, and that is useful for debugging, but it's also useful for monitors like the Thor Active Monitor. JSON Web Tokens are encoded strings that contains information such as user, but also expire times, and then they are signed by a cryptographic checksum. So let's see how we can debug this. The first thing we do is that we look at the Kubernetes extension in Visual Studio Code. This can all obviously be done command line, but it's a bit more user-friendly to use an IDE. In Visual Studio Code, we have a view of the cluster and the namespaces. And in this case, we have a problem with the Jupyter Hub and the authentication module. So we look at Jupyter Hub. And the first thing we want to do is to see what is actually happening on the inside. For that, we can connect to the workload or the pod using Visual Studio Code. Once we're connected, we can both explore the file system. This is actually in the pod itself, as well as we can get the terminal to see what's going on. And we can, down in the left-hand corner, see that we're connected to the pod in question. In order to debug a pod, we need to run the pod in debug mode. And we can see that it's running in debug mode just by looking at the terminal. Here we can see that we're using debug pi, and we're listening on port 5678 as a debug port. In order to connect our debugger, we need to use port forwarding, just like we did in our guestbook example in an earlier period. But in this case, we're going to connect a debugger instead of a browser. So let's look at how we do that. Simply go back to the Explorer, and once again, we right-click on the workload, and we can see that we have a port forward option. This will give us a port forwarding mechanism, which essentially does the same thing. It connects to the pod on a certain port, and it's opened the same port on our local host. All right, now we've done pretty much everything, but we also need to open up our code. And to do that, we can either download the code from the pod using the same system as we just looked at, which is essentially we go and pick the module and we choose download. Or we might already have the source code if we develop the module ourselves. In order to connect to a remote system using debug pi, we need to set up a launch module in Visual Studio. This is just a specification of how we connect to the pod. And this specifies that we connect on port 5678. We have something called path mappings, where we match where the source code is on our local machine, where the source code is on the remote machine. So this is where it sits on the server. And then there's a flag called just my code that you want set false because you want the breakpoint to catch you. Once this is set up, and you can start a debug session, and that will enable you to set breakpoints. And in our case, we got hit on breakpoints on failing to log in with the token that the user reported. And by debugging, we can inspect the variables and see what's going wrong. And looking down here, we can see that the exception is caused by an expired signature error. So there's something to do with timings. By looking closely at the JSON Web Token, we can see that the expiry time is the epochs 1656 and so on. This is, however, not so easy to decode. So in order to make it easier to see what time it actually expired, we can decode it by parsing it using datetime, and we can see that it expired on the 28th of June 2022. And looking at the current date, we can see that we're now on the 29th. So it's 1 day old, the token. So that's the reason why the user cannot log in. So this has been an example of how we can debug our pods using Visual Studio Code. And this will conclude this session.